The crystal chandeliers of the Washington Convention Center had witnessed many moments of diplomatic tension, but nothing like the silence that followed when Donald Trump pointed his finger across the masquerade of world leaders and said, "Let's be honest, Africa hasn't proven its intellectual capacity on the global stage." The cameras swiveled hungrily toward Ibrahim Traoré, the young Burkinabe leader standing composed in his traditional attire, while diplomats from 60 nations held their breath. Trump's voice cut through the ornate hall again, dripping with theatrical certainty. "I challenge you, right here, right now, to an intelligence test. Let's see what you've really got." The gasp that followed rippled through the assembly like wind through savanna grass, and somewhere in the back rows, an elderly Ghanaian delegate closed his eyes in prayer. Traoré's face remained serene as the weight of an entire continent settled on his shoulders, his fingers unconsciously touching the leather bracelet his grandfather had tied around his wrist the morning he left for university. The American media contingent pushed forward with their cameras, hungry for the spectacle of humiliation they assumed would follow, their lenses focusing on what they expected would be hesitation or anger. Instead, Traoré stepped forward with the unhurried grace of a man who carried centuries of wisdom in his bones, his lips curving into a smile that held no malice, only knowing. The moderator's voice trembled as she announced the unprecedented challenge would proceed immediately, while Trump basked in applause from his delegation, already composing his victory speech in his mind. The stage crew scrambled to set up projection screens and tablets as the world's attention crystallized on this singular moment, social media erupting in real-time disbelief across every time zone. Traoré closed his eyes briefly, and in that darkness his grandfather's voice emerged like dawn breaking over the Sahel. "Remember, my child, they mistake our silence for emptiness when it is actually fullness, waiting to speak." When his eyes opened again, they held the light of Timbuktu's ancient libraries, the mathematical precision of Dogon astronomers, and the unshakable dignity of Sankara's revolution. Trump adjusted his tie and winked at the cameras, completely unaware that he had just awakened something far older and wiser than his understanding could comprehend. The first question materialized on the massive screens, a labyrinthine geopolitical scenario involving resource allocation across disputed territories, and Trump's hand shot up before the moderator finished reading. His voice boomed with the rehearsed confidence of a man accustomed to boardrooms where volume substituted for substance, rattling off an answer peppered with corporate terminology about leverage deals and winners taking all. The American delegation nodded approvingly as cameras captured his self-satisfied smirk, that familiar expression he wore like armor, while he gestured broadly as if conducting an orchestra only he could hear. The moderator noted his response time with clinical precision, and Trump leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for what he assumed would be stammering confusion from his opponent. Traoré remained motionless, his eyes closed, breathing so steady that some wondered if he had heard the question at all. The silence stretched into uncomfortable seconds that felt like hours, and nervous laughter rippled through portions of the audience who mistook his stillness for paralysis. But those who knew the rhythm of deep thinking, the elders in the room who recognized meditation as the doorway to clarity, leaned forward with anticipation building in their chests. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, as though conversing with voices only he could access, pulling wisdom from wells that predated the marble floors beneath their feet. When Traoré finally opened his eyes, the room inhaled collectively, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure that precedes lightning. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a griot reciting, History, weaving together the ancient land management systems of the Ashanti, the water distribution mathematics of Timbuktu scholars, and modern conflict resolution frameworks into a tapestry so intricate that translators paused mid-sentence in amazement. The panel of international experts exchanged glances of disbelief, their pens frozen above notepads, as this young African leader dismantled and reconstructed the entire premise of the question with solutions that honored both heritage and innovation. Trump's smirk faltered at the edges, barely perceptible, but the cameras caught it, that microscopic crack in the foundation of his certainty as applause began building like distant thunder. The second question descended upon them like a test designed for scholars who had spent lifetimes in academia. A multi-layered scenario involving climate crisis, economic collapse, and mass migration patterns converging simultaneously. Trump attacked it with his trademark bravado, proposing walls and tariffs and bilateral agreements that sounded impressive to those who mistook complexity for competence. His answer a fortress of American first rhetoric that drew cheers from his corner of the auditorium. The moderator thanked him with diplomatic neutrality, while the clock displayed his rapid response time, and Trump pointed at Traoré with that familiar finger, his expression daring. The African leader to match his supposed brilliance. Traoré stood this time, his movement deliberate and graceful, and the room fell into that cathedral silence where every breath becomes audible. He began speaking of the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, where scholars studied astronomy and mathematics, while Europe stumbled through its dark ages, his voice painting images of manuscript libraries that held 700,000 texts when London was still a collection of mud huts. He connected those ancient astronomical calculations to modern climate modeling, drew lines from the communal farming systems of pre-colonial Africa to sustainable agriculture solutions, his hands moving. Like a conductor drawing music from the air itself, the solutions he proposed were not borrowed from Western textbooks, but emerged from the soil of African innovation, systems of reciprocity and environmental stewardship that his ancestors had perfected across millennia. The panel of experts began whispering urgently among themselves, their academic composure crumbling, as Traoré referenced specific mathematical proofs from 14th-century Malian scholars that directly addressed resource distribution algorithms. One professor from Oxford removed her glasses and leaned forward with her mouth slightly open, recognizing citations she had only encountered in the most obscure historical texts, her certainty about intellectual hierarchies dissolving with each word. Trump's jaw tightened visibly, his eyes darting to his advisors, who suddenly found their phones fascinating, while African delegates began standing one by one in silent tribute. The applause started slowly, then built into something resembling thunder across distant hills, echoing through chambers where Africa had been dismissed for centuries. The silence that followed held the weight of centuries, a pregnant pause where history itself seemed to reconsider its verdict on an entire continent. Traoré moved to the center of the stage with the confidence of a man who carried not just his own knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of countless ancestors whose brilliance had been deliberately erased from global memory. His eyes swept across the assembly, pausing on Trump's increasingly rigid posture, then settling on the panel of experts who represented the academic gatekeepers of what the world considered legitimate intelligence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the resonance of a griot recounting epic tales, yet every word was anchored in verifiable historical fact that transformed the room into a classroom where the West suddenly found itself desperately taking notes. He began weaving connections that no Western education had prepared them to follow, drawing invisible threads between the mathematical systems developed in ancient Kemet that gave the world geometry itself, and the modern algorithms governing artificial intelligence. Traoré spoke of the Ishango bone discovered near the Congolese border, a 20,000-year-old mathematical tool that predated European numerical systems by millennia, his hands tracing calculations in the air as if the numbers themselves were visible to those with eyes to see. The solutions he proposed for global economic inequality emerged from the Ashanti gold weight system, a sophisticated method of commerce and fairness that maintained social balance for centuries without the boom and bust cycles that plague modern capitalism. One by one, he dismantled the myth of African intellectual inferiority, replacing it with documented evidence of innovations in medicine, engineering, and philosophy that emerged from the continent while other civilizations were still finding their footing. The moderator had stopped pretending neutrality, her pen frozen above her notepad as Traoré referenced the astronomical observatory at Great Zimbabwe, where ancient Africans calculated planetary movements with stunning accuracy, their stone structures aligned with celestial precision that rival modern observatories. Trump shifted in his seat like a man sitting on hot coals. His earlier smirk completely vanished, replaced by the tight-lipped expression of someone realizing too late that he had challenged a master while possessing only apprentice knowledge. A delegate from Kenya stood and began a slow clap that spread through the African section like wildfire, then jumped continents as European academics rose to their feet, unable to deny the scholarly rigor of what they were witnessing. Even Trump's own advisors were nodding involuntarily, their phones now recording rather than hiding, recognizing that they were present for a moment when the narrative arc of history bent toward truth. Traoré concluded his response by proposing a specific framework for international cooperation based on the Kurukan Fuga, the 13th century Mandinka constitution that established human rights and environmental protection centuries before the Magna Carta became a footnote in Western legal history. His voice grew stronger as he detailed how this ancient charter addressed modern concerns of territorial disputes, resource sharing, and collective security with a sophistication that made contemporary international law seem primitive by comparison. The panel of judges sat stunned, several frantically searching their databases to verify his citations, only to find that every reference was academically sound, published in journals they themselves had contributed to but somehow never truly absorbed. Trump's frozen expression told the story that no words could capture, the realization dawning across his features that he had not merely lost a debate, but had stumbled into a revelation that would reshape how the world viewed African intellectual heritage. And the cameras captured every micro-expression of that humbling recognition for posterity to witness again and again. The moderator's hand trembled slightly as she unveiled the next question, her voice carrying across the hushed chamber like a bell tolling the hour of reckoning. Gentlemen, address this scenario. A resource-rich nation faces exploitation by foreign corporations while its people remain impoverished. How would you restructure this relationship to ensure sovereign prosperity? Trump leaned forward immediately, his recovery attempt transparent as glass, launching into a familiar corporate vocabulary about market partnerships and profit-sharing agreements that would allow international firms to maintain their operations while contributing nominal percentages to local development funds. His answer dripped with the same extractive logic that had bled continents dry for centuries, dressed now in the language of philanthropy and mutual benefit, and several delegates exchanged knowing glances that spoke volumes about how many times they had heard these empty promises before. Traoré waited until Trump's voice faded into the uncomfortable silence that follows shallow answers, then rose with the deliberate grace of a man about to honor the dead by speaking truth to power. Your answer preserves the master-servant dynamic that has kept Africa in chains, even after the physical shackles were removed," he said, his tone educational rather than accusatory, like a teacher correcting a student who simply had never been taught properly. He invoked Thomas Sankara's name with such reverence that it seemed the revolutionary leader's spirit materialized in the room, recounting how Burkina Faso's fallen hero had transformed his nation's agricultural output by rejecting foreign aid and empowering local farmers with resources, knowledge, and dignity. Traoré proposed complete nationalization of natural resources with community-controlled management boards, technical training programs that would make foreign expertise obsolete within a generation, and trade agreements where African nations set the terms rather than accepting whatever crumbs fell from the global table. The panel sat electrified, several members scribbling frantically as Traoré detailed implementation strategies drawn from Sankara's actual policies that had increased wheat production so dramatically that Burkina Faso achieved food self-sufficiency in just 3 years. An economist from the World Bank removed her glasses and wiped her eyes, whether from emotion or the uncomfortable recognition of decades spent enforcing the very exploitation Traoré was dismantling with each precisely chosen word. Trump's jaw tightened visibly, his hands gripping the podium edges as if the solid wood could anchor him against the tide of paradigm shift washing through the assembly. The African delegation rose as one body, their standing ovation beginning before Traoré even finished speaking, and this time delegates from every continent joined them, unable to deny the moral and practical superiority of solutions rooted in dignity rather than dependency. The moderator's voice carried a tremor of anticipation as she presented what the panel had privately termed the impossible scenario, a multidimensional strategic puzzle involving simultaneous economic collapse, regional conflict, and environmental catastrophe that would require synthesizing solutions across a dozen competing variables. Trump seized the moment with desperate hunger, his team huddling around him with tablets and advisors whispering frantically in his ear, while he sketched frameworks and calculations that consumed several minutes of increasingly uncomfortable silence. His final answer emerged as a patchwork of conventional strategies, each addressing isolated symptoms rather than underlying connections, delivered with forced confidence that fooled no one watching his eyes dart repeatedly toward Traoré's serene expression. Traoré closed his eyes, and the assembly watched something extraordinary unfold, his stillness becoming a kind of active meditation that seemed to slow time itself within the chamber's walls. Those who knew recognized immediately what they were witnessing, the ancient Dogon method of holistic problem-solving his grandmother had taught him, using stones and sand patterns under the baobab tree, where every element connected to every other in living relationship rather than mechanical sequence. When his eyes opened after barely 30 seconds, they held the clarity of spring water, and he began speaking, without notes or hesitation, weaving solutions that addressed all variables simultaneously through their interconnections rather than their separations. His answer flowed like ancestral rivers finding their courses, describing how environmental restoration would employ displaced populations while creating sustainable resources that would eliminate the economic desperation fueling regional tensions, each solution feeding into the next in elegant cyclical patterns that mimicked nature's own wisdom. The panel sat transfixed as he outlined implementation timelines and resource allocations with photographic precision, drawing from problem-solving methodologies that predated colonial borders. Methods his elders had preserved through generations, specifically for moments when Africa's children would need to remember who they were. Trump's face drained of color as comprehension dawned that he had not merely been outmatched, but existed in an entirely different paradigm. his corporate logic rendered obsolete by wisdom that measured time in centuries rather than quarterly reports. The head panelist broke protocol entirely, standing to applaud before the answer even concluded, her professional composure shattered by witnessing intelligence that transformed everything she thought she knew about leadership and genius. The moderator's hands trembled as she unveiled the final question, her voice carrying the weight of what this moment had become far beyond anyone's expectations or designs. Distinguished leaders, in 100 words or less, define what true global leadership means in our current age, and how you would embody it on the world stage. Trump straightened in his chair, his usual bluster momentarily fractured by the intellectual dismantling he had just endured, searching for the transactional language that had always served him. His answer emerged haltingly, filled with familiar phrases about strength and deals and winning. But the words landed hollow in a room that had just witnessed something transcendent, his deflections about America First principles, feeling suddenly small against the magnitude of the challenge Africa's son had presented. Traoré rose slowly to his feet, not from arrogance, but from the ancestral necessity to stand when speaking truth that your elders would hear across the spirit realm. Leadership is not dominion over others, but stewardship of our collective humanity. He began, his voice carrying the cadence of drums and morning prayer calls that had shaped Africa's conscience for millennia. He spoke of Ubuntu, that profound philosophy his grandfather had whispered to him in Murray. How a person becomes a person through other people. How no nation rises by keeping others submerged. His words painted visions of collaboration over competition, of lifting rather than climbing, of measuring wealth not in what you hoarded, but in what you shared to make the world whole. The African delegates began to weep openly, decades of diminishment and disrespect dissolving in the power of watching one of their own speak their deepest truths to the entire world. Traoré's voice swelled with emotion as he described leadership as the courage to remember what colonialism tried to erase, the wisdom to build futures on ancestral foundations rather than imported blueprints. True leaders do not ask to be proven, he declared, his eyes finding the cameras that carried his words to every corner of the earth. They simply serve, and in serving, they transform. The chamber fell into that rare silence that follows revelation, where even breathing feels like interruption, as the contrast between both answers hung in the air like dawn breaking over centuries of imposed darkness. The digital scoreboard flickered to life with numbers that rewrote history in real time, each ascending digit landing like drumbeats, announcing the arrival of truth, long denied. Traoré's scores blazed across the massive screen in categories the world had been conditioned to believe Africa could never master. His results in strategic thinking, historical analysis, and innovative problem-solving, surpassing not just Trump's figures, but shattering the established benchmark set by decades of previous summits. The camera operators instinctively zoomed toward Trump's face, capturing for posterity that precise microsecond when arrogance collapsed into comprehension, his practiced smirk freezing into something resembling a mask cracking from within. His eyes darted between the screen and Traoré with an expression photographers would later describe as the exact moment regret becomes visible on human features. The chamber erupted into applause that began with the African delegation, but spread like wildfire through representatives from Asia, South America, and even European nations, whose own scholars recognized intellectual brilliance transcending political theater. Delegates who had arrived with patronizing smiles now rose to their feet, their standing ovation carrying the weight of witnessed transformation, of assumptions shattered so completely that the applause felt less like congratulation and more like apology. Traoré stood motionless at his podium, not basking, but bearing the moment with the quiet dignity his grandfather had modeled, understanding this victory belonged to every African child who had been told they were less. Trump remained seated, his handlers whispering urgently in his ears, but the cameras remained merciless, documenting his isolation as the rooms celebrated around him like rain, finally falling on drought-scorched earth. The press gallery descended into controlled chaos as journalists frantically revised headlines that would circle the globe within minutes, their keyboards clicking out the story of how an African leader had just redefined what the world believed possible. Social media erupted simultaneously across continents, the footage spreading faster than networks could coordinate their coverage, millions watching the scoreboard revelation on repeat, as if needing confirmation that their eyes had not deceived them. In a modest classroom in Ouagadougou, where children sat crowded 3 to a desk, a young girl named Amara watched the summit on a borrowed phone held by her teacher, her small hands trembling as Traoré's scores illuminated the screen like stars finally visible after clouds had parted. She had grown up hearing whispered limitations about what African children could become, had absorbed doubt like second-hand smoke until this moment shattered every lie she'd unconsciously believed about her own potential. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she typed a message on her teacher's device with the fierce determination of someone who had just witnessed the impossible become mandatory, her words simple but carrying the weight of generational healing. Monsieur le Président, you showed the world what my grandmother always told me was true, that our minds hold galaxies they tried to convince us were deserts. Merci for giving us back our future. The message traveled through networks and security channels with unusual speed, aided by staffers who recognized its significance, reaching Traoré's phone on the podium just as the applause began its slow descent into reverent silence. His security chief handed him the device with knowing eyes, understanding some communications transcend protocol, and Traoré read Amara's words while cameras still focused on his face, capturing the exact moment his composed dignity fractured into raw humanity. His jaw tightened against emotion as he read the message twice, his thumb hovering over the screen as if touching sacred text, and those watching saw his eyes glisten with tears he no longer had strength to restrain. He gripped the podium with both hands, steadying himself against the tsunami of responsibility and love washing through his chest, understanding that this victory had never been about defeating Trump, but about liberating millions of Amaras from psychological colonization. The assembled leaders watched in hushed reverence as this warrior president wept openly, his tears visible on the giant screens, each drop a baptism washing away centuries of imposed inferiority. The chamber remained silent, witnessing vulnerability as the ultimate form of strength, as Traoré lifted his head and spoke directly to the cameras, his voice thick with emotion that made his words land deeper than any polished speech ever could. Traoré's voice filled the chamber with the resonance of ancestral drums as he spoke through tears that refused shame, dedicating his performance to every scholar burned in Timbuktu's libraries, every genius dismissed in colonial classrooms, every grandmother who preserved wisdom in whispered stories when books were forbidden. He spoke the names of Cheikh Anta Diop, Thomas Sankara, and Kwame Nkrumah like prayers, reminding the world that this moment was not his alone, but belonged to centuries of brilliance that had survived despite systematic erasure. His words carried the weight of vindication, for every African child told their potential had limitations, for every innovator whose contributions were stolen and rebranded, for every elder whose knowledge was dismissed as primitive until Western institutions repackaged it as discovery. The delegates from Accra to Nairobi sat with shoulders straighter than they had entered, feeling pride reclaim space in their chests where doubt had lived too long. He recounted his grandfather's final words before passing. the old man's weathered hand gripping his with surprising strength as he prophesied this exact moment, saying that the lion needs no test to prove he is king because truth requires no permission to exist. That prophecy had sustained Traoré through coup attempts and sanctions, through nights when liberation seemed impossible and mornings when doubt whispered louder than hope. And now it reverberated through this chamber as self-evident fact rather than desperate faith. Trump remained frozen in his seat, experiencing the unfamiliar weight of being intellectually outmatched on the world stage, his usual deflections useless against the mathematical precision of scored results. The cameras captured everything with brutal honesty. This historic reversal, where arrogance met its reckoning and dignity, required no raised voice to assert dominance. As Traoré concluded, he looked directly into the camera, knowing Amara watched, telling her and millions like her that they were the true victory, that their liberated imagination was the only score that mattered in history's long accounting. He reminded them that Africa's renaissance would not be televised as charity or framed as surprise, but recognized as the inevitable return of a continent that had given mathematics, medicine, and philosophy to civilizations that forgot to say thank you. His final words landed like revolution disguised as poetry, simple and devastating in their truth. That the world had not witnessed an upset today, but a homecoming, not an exception, but a preview of Africa's next chapter, written by her own children. The applause that followed felt less like congratulation and more like witnesses testifying to transformation, the sound of a narrative finally, irreversibly changed. The screen faded to black on Traoré's face, no longer proving anything to anyone, simply existing in the fullness of his purpose as cameras caught Trump exiting through a side door, unable to face the podium he had approached with such certainty hours before. History would remember this day not for the test itself, but for the moment collective consciousness shifted, when millions of children like Amara inhaled possibility deeply enough to fuel generations of uncompromising excellence. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou not as a champion-seeking celebration, but as a servant who had completed his assignment, knowing the real work continued in classrooms where his example would be transformed into action. The lion had never needed to prove anything. The world had simply needed its eyes adjusted to finally see what had always been true. What would you do if the world finally recognized your true worth? Subscribe to witness more stories of dignity, transformation, and the unstoppable rise of those who refuse to be diminished.